Well, good afternoon, everybody. Almost afternoon. We're between you guys and lunch, so hopefully we'll get everybody back in the room here. So for the next 45 minutes, I have the honor of having three very distinguished gentlemen from three different walks of life here. And so let me go ahead and introduce them. We have Szykman, right directly to my right here. He's the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Department of Commerce, so a very large distributed agency, to say the least, and diverse, I might add. Next to him, we have Brad Hokamp. He's the president of LayerTech, and they're a secure and compliant hosting company, so they have hosting facilities, and I'll let each of these gentlemen describe a little bit more about what they do and kind of some of the trends they're seeing right now as they help federal agencies make this move to the cloud. And then finally, I have Melvin Greer, who I yanked up here. We actually had a panelist that is on a plane, a red-eye, that is delayed a good 2 hours, so we bribed Melvin, I think, to get up here. And Melvin is with Lockheed Martin, and he's a senior fellow and chief strategist focusing on cloud computing for Lockheed Martin. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists. So I guess to start, I mean, as we sat and listened to the panel before us and then some of the speakers before us, I think everybody mentioned that the way that we look at cloud computing is everybody has kind of a different take on it. What is the cloud? And in fact, most of the time when I talk to anybody in government IT today, everything is the cloud, right? Every data center is the cloud. I think we heard one panelist say that, you know, if I have 1,900 data centers, I don't want 1,900 clouds. Right? And I think that that's kind of where we're at. And when I think of cloud computing, as I grew up as a developer way before my time at Microsoft, and when I think of cloud computing, I really just think of the fifth generation or the next generation of computing. Right? And the analogy that really comes to mind for me is something that happened to me when I entered the IT workforce, which is we kind of went from this DOS-based, if you were not in the mainframe world, on the PC world, this DOS-based world that didn't have a GUI interface that gave you a lot of control. You could write in assembly, C, basically any language you wanted to, and you had complete control of the operating system and can do all kinds of fun things, to kind of this GUI interface, whether you're using a Microsoft or an Apple product, that really went a layer above, right, and put a layer of abstraction, really removing some of the capabilities that you had underneath the hood. I could no longer, and in fact, I was extremely frustrated, I could no longer get access to that. Right? They had basically restricted what I could do, and I think that's really what we're doing as we think about what we're doing with cloud computing to the data center. Right? We're really going up the stack, trying to add a layer of automation so we can focus on the business needs, right, of agencies today, even or commercial entities in the world, and be able to provide computing power to the device anytime, anywhere. Right, without having to worry about you know, how many different servers you can install and actually walk through and turn on every single port and go in the DoD world STIG every single server, right, or go through FSMA and make a small change and you have to go through the whole process again, that we can really focus on that other layer. And that's really how I look at this. So I don't look at it as this newfangled technology. Right, so you can have private clouds, really anything that kind of goes up that stack and gives you kind of that layer on top, right, that gives you more operational efficiency. And so what I wanted to do is just really, with that in mind, open it up, and I'm going to give each of the panelists about 5 minutes to talk about what they do in their day jobs, and kind of give us a brief history of what they're thinking when it comes to cloud computing, and hopefully go into a little bit about how you guys see the cloud, and if you're running into that everything is the cloud kind of challenge.
Sure. I'm the CIO at the Department of Commerce. For those of you who are not familiar with the Department of Commerce, it is a very federated agency. We have about $2.3 billion of IT spending, but the majority of it is spent out in the Department of Commerce's bureaus. And the bureau missions are very diverse, from the Patent and Trademark Office, which deals with intellectual property, the Census Bureau, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has the National Weather Service, among other things. We have NIST, which is a research and standards organization. And so the federated nature is really an outgrowth of this diversity in missions associated with all the organizations that comprise the department. I would say we're viewing cloud as a great opportunity. But at the moment, it's something that we're looking at really from an opportunistic level. So there are a lot of focus on the use of the cloud for local needs within the bureaus. And then we have a few initiatives that we're looking at driving department-wide. And so that's really where my role is looking at the things that are department-wide. Where we're looking for those opportunities are the things that are most commoditized for several reasons. First of all, they're more mature in the way of services, things like cloud-based email, cloud-based web hosting, and web content management. They're also sort of related to the fact that they're commoditized. They're the things that are most common to all of the organizations. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense for the department level CIO to start picking at cloud opportunities that are only relevant to one or two of our organizations. The benefit of looking at the areas that are commoditized is it helps deal with some of the cultural issues. And as many of you working in this area know, the cultural obstacles are sometimes bigger than the financial obstacles or the technological obstacles. Really getting people to change their way of thinking about infrastructure, change their way of thinking about services, and IT in general. And for those areas that are more mature, people are, I think, a little more willing to accept the idea that some of these services can be cloud-based. And the perspective, I think, that they're always worried about out in the organizations is what the risk is to them. So the more commoditized and well accepted one of these services are, the more likely it is to get adopted sooner. And I think that's why you see across the entire government things like web hosting and email being the first types of applications that are being driven across large organizations.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks, Susie. My name is Brad Hokamp. I'm the president of LayerTech. Probably most folks here have not heard about LayerTech. We're, as Susie said, we're a managed hosting and cloud provider. We specialize in compliant and secure hosting. So obviously, we've been in the federal market for the last 10 years or so, and I'll go through some of that background in a minute. We also specialize in the commercial side of the business, have a strong heritage in the commercial side around the payment card industry. So obviously very highly secure requirements in the payment card industry, protecting credit card data. We do business with a lot of the big payment application providers, credit card companies, processors, those type of service providers, as well as in the commercial market in the HIPAA healthcare side of the equation. So we're fairly new at the healthcare market. There's actually a lot of crossover between HIPAA and some of the FISMA federal government requirements. A little more background on LayerTech from a federal experience perspective. As I said, we've been in the federal market for about 10 years. We actually acquired a company called New World Apps. New World Apps actually was in the federal business for the last 10 plus years. We acquired New World Apps back in August of 2012. So a little less than 6 months ago or so. And New World Apps, competing in the federal market, is doing business with the majority of the cabinet level agencies. So we have private cloud implementations with majority of the cabinet level agencies. Part of the intelligence community, we have a citizen-facing application or citizen engagement application with the intelligence community, and we also have a small implementation with the DoD. So we have very strong heritage in the federal market over the last 10 years. The good news about it, most of those implementations are private clouds or community cloud implementations, and we've secured 15 ATOs, authorizations to operate, over the last 3 or 4 years, going through that pretty intense FISMA certification process. So very strong heritage there. On the commercial side, we also have a lot of experience with clouds, obviously, both public clouds, private clouds. Most of what we do in the commercial side are community clouds for the payment card industry. So it's a multi-tenant, but it's really more of a community cloud. And we can spend more time on that in a minute. So a lot of heritage around cloud. In commercial, though, we were a big believer, at least based on the implementations we've done to date, the security requirements are very stringent. Even the web-based, citizen engaging applications still have very high level of security. So most of what we're implementing have been private clouds or community clouds. Our approach is, if we see it kind of from an infrastructure perspective, any survey you do in the marketplace, whether it's commercial or federal, the number one inhibitor to cloud adoption, generally, whenever you do the survey for the last 4 years, in 2013 or 2009, the number one inhibitor generally is going to be, or always is, I should say, security and compliance. So how do you provide that security and compliance, protect that data, isolate the data. So we think we have some unique approaches to it at LayerTech. We have some good ideas around that. What we actually do, though, around that is primarily in the federal space is more, again, as I said, mostly private cloud implementations. We completely manage the security and the compliance for the customer. So instead of basically enabling you to be compliant, we actually manage that for you, which means we manage all 344 controls for FSMA, for example. We provide all the security tools. We do the log management, remediation, the reporting, et cetera. So, and then we obviously work very closely with agency security teams to make sure we're compliant. We do the same thing on the commercial side. So we actually guarantee compliance in both the FSMA as well as the PCI and HIPAA side of the equation. But again, our approach is kind of stepping back and looking at cloud and what are the core business requirements of cloud. As Susie said, everybody says the cloud is just one big amorphous, basically. But the big promise of cloud is really around cost efficiencies, having on-demand resources, being agile or elastic type resources. So the question is, can you achieve that with lots of different service models or deployment models? We think you can. We think for the federal government, primarily today, it's mostly private and community clouds, eventually evolving to more of the public-facing clouds. But really, for the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be more of the private community variety to handle the security requirements.
Thanks. Melvin?
So let me start out by saying be careful who you become friends with, because you're likely to end up on a panel that you weren't planned to be on if you do. So Susie and I are good friends. We've worked together significantly in the development and the maturation of the Lockheed Martin cloud strategy. As I was introduced by Susie, I'm the strategist for cloud computing at Lockheed Martin, and I've been running the practice since about 2009. And so it's important to note that we hold dear and sacred the role that we play with relationship to our mission contribution to the warfighter, the analyst, as well as the citizen. And so when we look at cloud computing, there's some important aspects of it as we continue to support those missions that are important. Probably first and foremost is that there's no such thing as the cloud. The idea that there's this cloud or a cloud or one cloud that's huge out there is going to satisfy all these types of mission capabilities. And I look across 4,000 projects, and I can tell you that every type of cloud is in play. And what we're seeing is the predominant model for cloud computing is the hybrid cloud. Additionally, when we first started development of our cloud strategy, we saw this large discussion about what is cloud computing. It's what I'll call Cloud 1.0. Cloud 1.5 is, well, now that I know a little bit about what it is, can I secure it? And so there's significant focus on how we secure cloud computing. And as my esteemed panelists indicated, cloud security is a significant inhibitor to adoption. But I have to applaud our agency friends at NIST and GSA and the folks in the PMO for FedRAMP and across government. They've spent a significant amount of time codifying what we mean by cloud computing security, and that's had a significant impact on people understanding how to adopt secure cloud. In fact, Lockheed Martin leads its cloud strategy with security, as we're a cybersecurity firm. But 2013 is not the year of Cloud 1.5 anymore. 2013 is the year of Cloud 2.0, which is, now that I have one of these secure clouds, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to do with it? And so most of the time that I spend at work, I spend focusing on helping our clients decide what it is that they're going to do with clouds. Are they going to do mission capabilities in logistics, in transportation, in medicine and medical records? Are we going to use cloud computing for advanced research and development, in gamification, in synthetic biology, in quantum physics? Am I going to use cloud computing as a primary ingest method for the development of data products to support cyber intelligence and analytics? Each of these kinds of mission capabilities is important, and each of them have a different profile for cloud computing. And so our perspective is the right cloud for the right mission is the best idea.
Thanks. Well, since everybody's mentioned security, why don't we just go ahead and tackle that first? And if I look at, when I look at security and compliance, there's the straightforward security compliance, the 800-53 FISMA, FedRAMP compliance, which is really just think of a series of security controls that you need to meet. You go through an audit, you find that you meet these, but there's some also some things in whether it's DICAP, right, or the FISMA and FedRAMP process, or a combination of both, and whether you're looking at a moderate system or a high impact system. But there's also a series of what I call characteristics that kind of are on the outside of that. Right? And those are things like, should and do I need my agency data protected by only US citizens? And should they have a background investigation? And should that background investigation be a public trust moderator, a public trust high, or DoD top secret, or DoD secret? And should I be concerned on whether or not my data stays in the continental United States or not? Right? Or can I depend on a layer of protection that is properly mandated, maybe perhaps in those standards that's out there today? And when we talk to agencies, and when I talk to them in my day job, I find this to be all over the board. It is clearly, when you get to obviously the classified information, there's a clear demarc there where people are not, right? Everything needs to stay in the US, it needs to be US citizens. But once you go below that area, there seems to be, there's no common ground here. It really just depends on who you talk to and what they feel the level of assurance is with a particular vendor. So I'd love to get your take, one, on how do you think the federal government's doing today from an agency perspective, and then from a FedRAMP perspective and adoption of FedRAMP and the controls, kind of the good, bad, and ugly. What are the good things about it, and what are the things you hope that agencies or vendors like a Microsoft or a Lockheed Martin would do a little different? And then how do you see these other challenges, these things that kind of are outside of a typical security compliance realm, where they're really not mandated? It's not mandated to have US citizens, but sometimes people want it, right? And is that a challenge, do you think, as we move forward? Do you think that needs to be mandated, or what are your thoughts on that? And anybody can go first.
So I'll start. I'll start off with FedRAMP. I think FedRAMP is definitely a great thing. A lot of people think of it as a security framework, but the security framework is really FISMA, and what FedRAMP does is it embodies that in a way that allows organizations to provide reusability for the entire framework. And so really, FedRAMP is aimed at facilitating the adoption of cloud by eliminating the repetitive rework and recertification, accreditation, or authorization of these systems across many organizations that might ultimately be using the same set of infrastructure. That's definitely, even though it's just getting off the ground now, is a key enabler. One of the things that we ran into at Commerce going back 3 years when cloud was maybe not as prevalent, but definitely already viewed as a hot area, we had one bureau at Commerce was interested in moving to a cloud-based system for emergency notification. When there's some kind of disaster, you need to communicate with employees, you send out, you make phone calls and send out emails and so on. They wanted to move to a cloud-based system. They had to go through quite a bit of work for putting in place an authority to operate for that system. It was quite cumbersome because the vendors themselves were not as accustomed to dealing with these types of requirements for their own infrastructure as people on the government side were. A few months later, we had another bureau at Commerce wanted to use exactly the same system and had to go through a huge amount of repeated work to effectively provide the same authority to operate for that system. Now, they did communicate quite a bit. The vendor allowed them to share information about security testing and evaluation, some risk assessment, but a huge amount of work had to be repeated across two organizations in a single department. And so you can just amplify that across the entire government space, and the cost associated with security for cloud infrastructure could have been, probably is quite high, but could have been much higher without something like FedRAMP in place. So FedRAMP is a key enabler. To the question about some of these other issues, whether people need clearances, they need to be citizens, whether information needs to reside within the US, I think all those answers to those questions really need to derive from the requirements of the mission. In some cases, you may not have as much concern if you're just hosting data that's being publicly served through a public website to the average citizen, maybe it's not as much a concern that the people who might have access to that information be US citizens. You can all certainly think of other scenarios where you might actually want access to data to be limited to US citizens. The data sovereignty issue is, it's a little bit of a different issue actually, because once data is stored outside of the US, it's subject to local laws in other nations that may be different from ours. And so we may want data to be protected within a certain, in a certain way, but in another country subject to those laws, potentially the government could come in and access that data even if, regardless of what kind of contracts you have in place with the infrastructure providers. So there are some concerns there that I think need to be dealt with. And certainly there are other countries that have similar data sovereignty concerns over data that resides in the United States.
And I think, you know, 3 years ago when we were talking about cloud computing, I think we all hoped that the worldwide regulatory stance would change dramatically by this time. And what we found is it really hasn't, right? There's no protections for data stored, whether it's a Microsoft or a Google or an Amazon data center, if it's outside the United States. No matter how much we'd want to safeguard that, we'll be at the, we'll have to turn over data if we're required to by law. So yes, I think it is definitely an interesting challenge as we start to see federal agencies move to the cloud.
Yeah, I'd comment it's interesting. We're actually, LayerTech are big, this might be not that popular, but we're actually big fans of FISMA and the FedRAMP process. On the FISMA side of it, we have a lot of experience. As I said earlier, we've gone through 15 different ATOs. What we've been surprised about, kind of the lessons learned in that process over the last 3 or 4 years, is that every agency has kind of a different interpretation of those 344 controls. So the level of interpretation varies quite a bit. So one agency might have a much more stringent definition of different controls versus another. So so the process basically is going to vary as far as how long a time it's going to take to actually get that ATO approved. We also learned, though, through that process, and we became much more intelligent around security. So I think that the committee putting together the FISMA standards did a great job as far as, here are the potential back doors into the environment from a security perspective. So we learned a lot through that process working with different agencies. What FedRAMP really does, and LayerTech's going through the FedRAMP process now to get essentially approved as a cloud service provider. But as Simone talked about, it really helps the agencies quite a bit. So certify once, so to speak, and use many times, I think is what the standard, at least that's the goal state of FedRAMP. So we think the other big benefit of FedRAMP, though, is it's much more prescriptive. So from we've seen a lot of documentation like FISMA, et cetera, but the controls are much more prescriptive. So it's not going to be left open to interpretation by the various agencies, security teams, et cetera. So it's going to kind of standardize, I would say raise the bar, so to speak, using obviously the FISMA controls, but get it much more prescriptive. So we think it's going to be great for agencies. It's going to be great driving more adoption of cloud services, no matter what the deployment model is. So we're a big fan of both FISMA as well as the FedRAMP side of it.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Lockheed Martin is leading its cloud strategy with security. So this is not, and of course we're a cloud provider and a cloud consumer. So this is not a trivial conversation for us at all. There's 2 important aspects, though, that might be interesting to you. The first is that when we started looking at how people are deploying and looking at cloud security, it's clear that the people who are having difficulty deploying enterprise security are having significant difficulty implementing cloud security. That's probably obvious, but that's something that is a very important finding. If you can't do a security plan, understand the definitions of cloud capabilities, and deploy them with rigor and intelligence in your enterprise, it's simply going to exacerbate the problem when you try and move it to a multi-tenant virtualized environment with a shared capability or maybe even a hybrid environment. Secondly, when it comes to these additional things, there's some important aspects. We are a global company, so all of these laws that govern data sovereignty are ones that we track, and I spend a significant amount of my time understanding things like Article 29 from the EU and how data sovereignty and data privacy is handled much differently in that set of countries than here or any of the other countries where we do business. what I can say to you is that we've tried explicitly to separate this concept of the ability to develop a secure cloud from the legislation required in order to protect data. A person who's responsible, a very senior security person responsible for development of a security strategy in a hybrid cloud does not own the ability to create and implement legislation that protects users' data. And that's a very different kind of discussion to have. And I think our companies, mine and Susie's and others, have spent a significant time trying to help people in government, and I think people are getting the message that data sovereignty laws, data privacy laws, and I think users are now raising their level of sophistication as the ultimate data owner, that we need to think about how the laws are actually being developed around privacy and data sovereignty in this country so that it can have a positive impact on cloud provisioning and adoption.
Great, thanks. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk a little bit about the different types of workloads that can move to the cloud and how agencies, what are some of the best practices agencies can look at as they start to identify workloads that might be good candidates for the cloud, and how do you define whether it is a good candidate or not? And when I look at this, I mean, we've put together multiple frameworks, and you can look at, what's the data classification? Is it sensitive data? Where does it live? Is it end of life? There's a variety of different factors, right, you can look at to decide, and then you have to go and pick a cloud. And a lot of times we associate kind of the word commodity with cloud. In fact, it's almost impossible if you read an article about cloud not to see commodity, right, in that article. And when I think about commodity, if you look at the definition of commodity in the dictionary, it doesn't really apply so much to it applies somewhat to cloud, but really, if you look at where we're at in just the evolution of cloud computing, I don't think it's exactly synonymous with the same thing as cloud. And so I'd love to get your opinion on, as agencies begin to move to the cloud, and we look at the simple things like, and I say simple kind of jokingly, but we look at email, and we look at, right, some of these things that we're starting to call commodity, because it is to some degree. There's still different features, right? I think of commodity as electricity, right? I don't have a feature of electricity I can typically turn on and off. You can get more wattage, but those features are very limited, right? And we're trending that way in email. Right now, we're trending that way in infrastructure as a service, raw storage, compute, content delivery network capabilities, right? I kind of consider in that bucket of probably the first commodities, cloud computing commodities. And that's really the jumping off point, I think, for federal agencies. We're seeing virtualization, taking existing workloads and moving them to the cloud. But what are those next workloads that we're going to start to see move to the cloud? And how should agencies be identifying those and picking whether that particular workload is best served by a private cloud, right, a public cloud hosted by another vendor, or perhaps in a community or a government community cloud? We can go down the line again, or we can start this way.
Can we start, or go ahead?
Okay, so let me just reiterate that there is no one thing called cloud, and I appreciate this idea that we have different types of workloads for different types of clouds. So there is no one cloud answer, which is why I think this idea of a cloud broker, understanding how we focus in on the top two aspects after security that are inhibiting cloud adoption, which are cloud interoperability and then data portability. Focusing on those two now really will help drive how cloud adoption goes forward. One of the things that we're seeing is that there are a number of significant mission capabilities that are actually being developed in the cloud. And so there's some classes that we can talk about. On the defense side, we see things like training and virtual worlds. We see gamification becoming important, not just in defense, but across. This move from defensive cyber security to offensive cyber intelligence is cloud-enabled. And then this idea of developing citizen-centric services that take full advantage of the mobility and big data capabilities that are already driven inside citizen models. But what I will end with is that I believe that the most significant area of focus when trying to decide what the workload is for the cloud is the business model that goes with the cloud offering that you're putting together. We have developed thousands of cloud offerings, none of which are going to make any money or provide any value. And we discard all those. We're really interested in understanding the business model that is appropriate to the right cloud deployment model. If you don't get those two right, you might have a really, we used to have websites that nobody went to visit. We used to have objects that nobody reused, code that sit in library. You can go on and on and on back in time. It's the same thing with cloud. You want to focus in on the business model that's appropriate for the cloud offering. When you get that right, things tend to work out better.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Melvin on the business model should drive it, because all the promise of cloud, as I said earlier, is most of it is what Susie said as well, is it's supposed to be a commodity. So you're basically buying resources, by the drink, so to speak, or metered billing, and then you can have very elastic use of resources, so turn up, turn down. So that promise of cloud can be very valuable, but the question is, does that support the business model or the business application? Can you take advantage of that? And then you have to balance it with the cost efficiency or effectiveness of that promise, as we talked about earlier, with security and compliance requirements. So what's going to win as far as what's more important to your business model, protecting the data, making sure it's secure, along with taking advantage of that resource pooling or shared resources. So that's kind of the debate you have to have. I think both the commercial world as well as the federal side of it, we see is, as Melvin said earlier, most implementations are being done in more of a private or in a community-type cloud environment, and some hybrids. So we're seeing kind of a mix of all those. The commodity part of cloud, as Susie said earlier, that's Amazon. So if you want on-demand resources, doesn't have to be secure, is for your test and development, is a perfect application for it. But if you have a business application, doesn't have a lot of elasticity requirements, has heavy security requirements, it's not going to be good to go on a shared public cloud implementation. So we see at LayerTech in New World Apps, from a standpoint of our experience, is that most of the implementations are, as I said earlier, are private or community clouds. The applications or workloads, we're seeing much more than just email coming over. We're seeing, we're seeing the citizen engagement type applications, so the web-facing applications. We're also seeing point applications. So we're seeing payroll coming over. So not the whole ERP system, but payroll, a point application coming over to a private cloud or community cloud. We're seeing procurement type applications. So again, point applications, not whole platforms coming over, but kind of point applications coming over. We think that would be kind of the next big wave until you get to kind of whole infrastructure platforms coming over to the cloud.
Yep, I'll just echo another voice of agreement for the sort of the linking of what's being moved to the cloud with what the requirements are from a mission and infrastructure perspective. We've heard a couple of different types of things that might drive people to the cloud, wanting on-demand capabilities, wanting an elastic infrastructure. Obviously, the whole idea of being able to get infrastructure as a service, moving capital investments to operating expenses is another one. You avoid the upfront purchasing of infrastructure. Sometimes just the need for speed is another reason to move to the cloud, because you can set up an infrastructure in the cloud more quickly than an agency could go through a prolonged procurement process to buy equipment and set it up and configure it and manage it. Another driver is the whole data center management and data center consolidation initiatives that the government has been going through. If you have a need for new infrastructure, the availability of the cloud is a way to get new infrastructure without establishing a new data center, or in some cases can support the consolidation and closure of existing data centers. And in some cases, it may just be a convenient mechanism for bridging distributed boundaries. So one example that we have at Commerce is moving some of our help desk support software to the cloud to support a help desk consolidation effort among multiple organizations that are currently independently managed from an IT infrastructure perspective. And so setting up a single help desk software system for service management and ticketing and so on would be more cumbersome to do across multiple organizations if it were managed internally, but putting a cloud-based solution that can be integrated with all these distributed organizations is a much easier way to support this help desk consolidation effort. So you really need to understand what your needs are and why it is you would consider cloud before you can really look at at the various models that are out there and decide which one makes sense for your organization.
Great, thanks. We have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to open it up and see if we have any questions from the audience. Anybody? Over here, I think.
Hi, a couple of things. We started off with that intriguing question because, you know, we hear this all the time that everybody thinks the cloud is a different thing. It's like I want to take my, legacy applications and I want to move it to the cloud. And really what they're saying is I want to web enable it and make it available anytime, anywhere. So whenever we're trying to come up with solutions, I'm always going, okay, what is the box that we put around to make a success criteria when they say, I want you to do this cloud initiative, and you're like, are you really want to do a cloud initiative, or you really wanting me to just modernize your application? And the follow-up is I kept hearing a lot about the hybrid cloud, and I don't know enough about it. Maybe that could be articulated or defined for us.
Okay, so for sure, let me talk about the first thing. I think that pragmatic approach about having a serious discussion about what you mean by cloud and what you mean by going to the cloud is important. We spend a lot of time having that discussion. I spend a significant amount of time having that discussion as well. Of course, sometimes we have people who are determined to go to the cloud for whatever reason. And so it's important to understand what it is that they're looking for. What are the metrics? On the mission side, the metrics are much different than on the technical side, right? So instead of having 5 nines availability, 1,000% never hacked in security, now it might be, I want to reduce fratricide by 10%. How's the cloud going to help me do that? How is the cloud going to help me provide better food safety? How's the cloud going to be able to help me provide better mission capability for deep space exploration? These are the kind of metrics that we see and that now we're using to determine whether or not the cloud is the right spot. From a hybrid cloud perspective, I think it's a great question. Hybrid cloud computing is the combination of one or more cloud types with the enterprise. So in government, rarely do we see a situation where the cloud or the cloud solution is the only solution providing IT deployment capabilities. So a hybrid cloud would be a connection of the enterprise to one type of cloud, or multiple types of clouds, hybrid, public, private, community, and others connected to provide a hybrid capability. And just like in your personal life, you have more than one cloud that operates for you. You have a cloud that handles your email, or you may have several clouds. Like I have several clouds that handle my email capabilities. I have a cloud that allows me to communicate pictures to my family. I have another cloud that allows me to do work at Lockheed Martin. I have another cloud that allows me to do work at another business or another set of functions. So what I do is I pick the capabilities for all these clouds based on what I'm trying to achieve. And a hybrid cloud is the one model that we see going forward because no one type of cloud satisfies all the needs that we have. Can you imagine if you tried to use Facebook for everything? You just can't do it.
No.
Did I answer your question? Okay, great.
This is a really good question. This question was asked in an earlier panel. They said, well, if I look at a legacy application and I don't have the money to go and actually rebuild it from the ground up, how is the cloud going to help me? And I think that if you look at the great work NIST did, and they had a set of characteristics there, I don't see discouraging agencies, at least I don't, from looking at kind of cherry picking the characteristics that make sense for them if it makes business sense and it meets their mission needs. And so a great example are, if you look at all the legacy information systems that are out there, I know VA has done a lot of work in this area where they have a lot of legacy systems running on legacy hardware, but they want to be able to kind of integrate those in a better fashion. And so what they've been able to do is provide, patient information systems on top of those. They could easily be virtualized, right, and hosted in a private cloud or moved to a public cloud or a community cloud, and you have that hybrid cloud environment. So I think there is actually a huge space and huge need for this hybrid cloud to be able to help. And if you look at there was a slide that was put up earlier today by Dave DeBreeze that he said if you look at how DoD is looking at it, they had 4 different buckets really. They had modernization, then they had, basically you're going to retrofit, and then they mapped that to, is this an infrastructure as a service opportunity, or is this a platform as a service and software as a service opportunity? And I think if you look at those 4 buckets that he had up there, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, if you look at those 4 buckets, I thought it was a great way to kind of look at, here's the mission, here's my application, is it end of life, here's the mission need, and here's the types of clouds that I should start looking at that might be able to help me, right? It might be from moving from CapEx to OpEx, right? And then that can be a huge cost savings for a lot of agencies. So I don't think there's a one-size-shoe-fits-all.
It's also, real quick, on the hybrid discussion, it could be your application, your point application you're working on could be hybrid. So your databases, for example, without getting too much detail, it could be on private dedicated gear, and you're bursting or using shared infrastructure or multi-tenant infrastructure for your web front end, for example. So it could be across your organization, as we're talking kind of more of a galactic basis, even within your application. I would say 95% of what we're implementing at LayerTech, both in the government, commercial, are hybrids. So it's really a mix of the two environments, whether it's point application or kind of a broader basis. You also, in hybrids, the other kind of classic definition of it, it's one of those things where there's a lot of different definitions. Customers, big commercial customers, for example, are buying kind of cloud, you're building their own cloud broker type capability, kind of a software interface to get a broker out to different kind of commodity clouds. So they have internal applications or databases, things like that, on private cloud environments, and then brokering out to the public commoditized cloud for various implementations. So there's a lot of different definitions of hybrids as well, but most of what we're seeing are hybrids in practice.
Next question.
Yes, John Weiler, IT Acquisition Advisory Council. I heard the word metrics, love it. And we're finding that government agencies don't really have a good handle on metrics or SLAs, which make the transition to the cloud and building the business case and making investment very difficult. We've interviewed some 200 agency representatives, and few could say that they had a full understanding of what their cost of value delivery of their legacy systems, but it was 75% of their budget. And when we look at the statistics out of international bodies, like Gartner Group, virtualization, which everybody says, oh, let's go virtualize everything, that's about a 5% savings, and sometimes because it's, you're just utilizing some excess CPU. The real value and what we're seeing ROI on is actually modernize those legacy apps, either using automated tools or just throwing them out and buy a COTS solution. But that is, it is the legacy systems cost and the time and effort that it takes to maintain those is keeping government from achieving these goals and these efficiencies. And I would encourage anybody to really take a hard look at what is the value of those legacy systems and either throw it out or use some automated tools to modernize them, because that's where the big benefit moving to the cloud will be.
We have time for one more question, I think. Oh, going to the corner.
If you grace me with maybe 2 questions. John Keyes, Autonomic Resources. A couple of questions. I think the government standards, interested in your perspective in terms of formalizing security standards like FedRAMP, for instance. Do you think that that's allowing agencies to define what the end result of IT computing is for them, as opposed to the traditional, we'll define how it's built, and the SI builds, and then the end result is what the agency wants, and defining, again, just allowing them to define the end result? And then second, if that's potentially true, how do you feel that the cloud, the enablement of cloud is changing the traditional SI and distribution models that exist within the federal space?
So I guess I'm the SI, and I gotta come up with some answer. What's your name? Yeah, the one who asked the question.
I'm sorry, my name is John Keyes, Autonomic Resources.
Okay, thank you, John. So I think very 2 insightful questions. Interesting that you linked standards development to business outcomes, because what we're seeing is there's significant work going on in standards. The IEEE, OASIS, DMTF, these types of standards, OMG. I belong to all of those and participate on their cloud standards development working groups. And I can tell you they take very seriously the gap between adoption and the development of cloud standards, and working really hard to identify cloud security, data portability, and interoperability standards. But I don't know that there's a correlation between the development of standards and the metrics associated with business outcomes. I actually believe with this other John that just spoke earlier, that the metric associated with cloud computing adoption is really tied into the agency mission statement. So the outcome, when we look at new requests for cloud services, they tend to be drafted in such a way so that the technical capabilities that might be affected by a standard are less evident, and the mission outcome is more evident as a metric. Your second question is also, I thought, insightful. We are definitely seeing a change in the acquisition strategy for cloud services. When you have an industry day, well, when you have an industry day that's held on Twitter, that's an indication something's changed. You know, if you don't have access to Twitter from your enterprise environment, like we didn't, that tells you there's something changing. When you see one of the core aspects of the FedRAMP trust model being a change in the acquisition of cloud services, then you know something's changing. So yes, I would say that significantly we've seen a difference in the acquisition strategy of cloud services as a result of some of the standards and the work that is going on in the government.
I would say just real quick, I think the next panel is going to talk a lot about FedRAMP, but it's, as I said earlier, we do think it's really standardizing. You're always going to have some nuances around it. It's going to help accelerate cloud adoption, and it's going to standardize the security controls around it. Where today it's, as I said, you know, with FISMA, just FISMA standalone is up to interpretation. So with FedRAMP, it's really standardizing that process.
So with that, I think we're out of time as the panel is lined up here. I think this is the hint. So I want to thank everybody and thank our panelists.